In 1917, not one, but two revolutions took place in Russia. The second one is known as the October Revolution. But was it really a revolution and not more of a coup? And what preceded it? That and more you will find out today, because in this video I'm going to talk about the October Revolution and the birth of Soviet Russia. Hey, good to have you back on the channel. If you're happy to be new, my name is Stefan. I'm a history teacher from the Netherlands and I'm hustling history for you. And if you liked it, then please consider subscribing and also hit that notification bell. Now, normally I like to cover events that are confined to a specific spot, like this event, on location. Yet, in 2019, I did visit St. Petersburg and will make use of the footage that I recorded there. As for the dates, till January 1918, the old-style Julian calendar was used in Russia, which was 13 days behind the Gregorian calendar used in the rest of Europe. I will make use of the old-style dates. When the February Revolution was over, the Tsar had abdicated and two power centra emerged. The Duma Committee, which of the day of Grand Duke Mikhail's renunciation of the throne, March 3rd, became the provisional government, and the Petrograd Soviet. Key figure was Alexander Kerensky. Now, fun fact is that Kerensky's father was the teacher of Vladimir Ulyanov, Lenin, and both members of the Lenin and the Kerensky family were friends. Now, anyway, as a socialist, Kerensky, he had basically both feet in the Duma and in the Petrograd Soviet. The Petrograd Soviet had issued Order Number 1. Where this came down to was that the soldiers would obey the orders of the Duma as long as they did not interfere with the ones of the Soviet. And this served as a kind of bridge between both legislative bodies. The provisional government enacted a series of measures. The death penalty was abolished, court-martials were reduced, and all citizens became equal for the law. Later, universal male and female suffrage was established. On pressing issues of food, the provisional government created a state monopoly. What did it change was the war. The provisional government was convinced that a new democratic Russia would inspire the Russian soldier to continue the fight. As the United States entered the war, it gave way for renewed, albeit misplaced, confidence. The war against the Central Powers did continue, and the situation in the army grew worse. On April 3rd, after a decade of exile, Vladimir Lenin arrived in Petrograd at Finland Station. His trip was sponsored by the German authorities, who hoped he would stir up things in Russia since the Germans were still in war with Russia. Lenin was greeted by a crowd, and on his way to the Bolshevik headquarters, he gave speeches at different intersections. Nikolai Sukhanov, a Russian writer, wrote the following about Lenin. He was an orator of enormous impact and power, breaking down complicated systems into the simplest and most generally accessible elements, and hammering them into the heads of his audience until he took them captive. The next day, Vladimir Lenin outlined his ideas in the April thesis. There, he denounced the provisional government and he denounced the war with Germany. Now, do notice that for that very moment, these ideas were fairly radical, and the Bolshevik Party did receive a backlash from mainstream media. They denounced Lenin as a German agent. It left the Bolsheviks in the margins. Well, this was a good place to be in, because as agitators, they could expand their influence amongst the soldiers and the workers. As Sukhanov wrote, Lenin's group was not directly aiming at the seizure of power, but it was ready to seize it in favorable circumstances, which it was taking steps to create. On June 18th, initiated by Alexander Kerensky, the so-called Korenski Offensive took place. It was a desperate attempt to defeat the Germans on the Eastern Front, and this became a massive military disaster. As the military was in crisis, so were politics in Petrograd. Bolshevik slogans that before were too radical now became mainstream. Slogans as peace, land, bread, and all power to the Soviets. Demonstrations and strikes occurred. It was followed by shooting, which left several people dead. During these July days, the provisional government did restore order. They closed the Bolshevik newspaper, Pravda, which means truth. Leon Trotsky was arrested, and Vladimir Lenin, he fled to autonomous Finland. And the Bolsheviks therefore retreated to the sidelines. But they didn't stop. No, they did continue their agitation. Up and down the front and in all major Petrograd factories and key cities, grassroots agitators tirelessly hawked the Bolshevik brand. Indeed, the front army was the site of intensive media warfare. Not only did Bolshevik newspapers flood the ranks, but the committees published their own newspapers, which relayed the news of events in the capital. The ordinary, literate or semi-literate soldiers, certainly the non-coms, were fully aware of political developments. In order to restore the situation on the front, Kerensky had appointed Kornilov as commander-in-chief, replacing Brusilov. Kornilov was a Siberian Cossack and a militarist by nature who wanted to restore discipline in an army that was plagued by war fatigue. It was Kornilov who staged a coup near the end of August. Now the story of the Kornilov coup, or Kornilov affair as it became known as, is fairly complicated since historians also differ in their approach toward this attempted coup. But what you need to know for now is that Kornilov had an army and he marched towards Petrograd. Kerensky, he was in panic and he therefore was forced to cooperate with the Bolsheviks who armed the workers. Now eventually it didn't came to a climactic battle since a part of Kornilov's troops mutinied and the others got demoralized and quit. Kornilov was jailed, his putsch had failed, and this paved the way for Bolshevik takeover. Lenin returned to Petrograd on October 7th, but he lay low, since he was still a wanted man. And do notice that among the left-wing parties there were factions such as the Mensheviks and the Socialist Revolutionaries, known as the SRs, who on their turn were divided into left and right SRs, and they were definitely not all on the same page. But the same goes for within the Bolshevik party. Even within the Bolshevik ranks, people differed in opinion on what to do. For example, Lev Kamenev, he argued that an armed revolt was way too risky and he wanted to be careful. But Lenin, he thought differently. Power must be seized immediately, at once. Everyday loss could be fatal. History will not forgive us if we do not take power now. The situation on the front was more than dire, as the Germans now had taken Riga and they also captured the West Estonian archipelago. Kerensky, he ordered soldiers from Petrograd to the northern front. On October 9th, the Petrograd Soviet established a Military Revolutionary Committee, MRC, in support of Soviet authority against the provisional government. The Bolsheviks seized great influence on the MRC. On October 23rd, the MRC gained control of the Peter Paul Fortress and the Kronwerk Arsenal, and on October 24th, the Central Telegraph Office and the wire service were taken. Later, they also took train stations, government buildings, banks, and the Central Post Office. Bolshevik leaders framed their moves in defense of the revolution. Under the cover of the Petrograd Soviet, the Bolsheviks had put strong organizational structures. Other socialist factions saw this, but they didn't act. The storming of the Winter Palace was the final act in the Bolshevik seizure of power. On October 25th, in the afternoon, pro-Bolshevik soldiers and Red Guards surrounded the Winter Palace where the provisional government was at. Kerensky by the time had already left in a car borrowed from the US Embassy. They demanded the surrender and explained that the guns of the Peter Paul Fortress as well as cruiser Aurora were aimed at the palace. At 9:30 p.m., the ship fired several blanks. The defenders slowly drifted away from the palace. In the early hours of the next morning, the storming of the Winter Palace took place. Now do notice that this storming of the Winter Palace did not happen like it was portrayed in the 1928 Soviet propaganda film made by Sergei Eisenstein. Here you see a large crowd of enthusiastic pro-Bolshevik fighters storming the Winter Palace, meeting heavy defenses and overcoming them. No. They most likely went through the back door. Now, I did visit the Winter Palace in 2019, and there was a very small placard or memorial on one of its walls, and in the back of the Winter Palace there was a small door, so perhaps the Bolsheviks went through there. The ministers of the provisional government were arrested and escorted to the Peter Paul fortress. The Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies, which consisted mostly of Bolsheviks by now, located in the Smolny Institute, issued several decrees the following day. Although he had objected to the timing of the coup, Lev Kamenev now introduced a series of decrees, ending the death penalty at the front, releasing political prisoners, ordering Korenski's arrest, which were then endorsed by the Congress Assembly. Lenin himself presented the decree on peace, Decret o Mire, without annexations or indemnities, and the decree on land, Decret o Zemlya, the left SR's platform of land seizure without compensation. After the Bolshevik takeover, a counter-revolution did take place, but it was not successful. Korenski, he made it out of the city and he went on his way to Pskov. There he tried to rally the troops to crush the Bolshevik takeover, but this failed since the Bolsheviks had already gained the support of the soldiers both at the front and outside the city. Some skirmishes did take place, leaving 200 casualties near the end of the day, but by that time the counter-revolt was snuffed out. Later, military school cadets took over several Bolshevik strongholds and waited for the troops of General Pyotr Krasnov. These were still miles away, and thus the so-called Junker mutiny failed. Krasnov and his 700-strong Cossack unit were overwhelmed on October 30th at Sasu Selo and surrendered. Therefore, the Korenski-Krasnov uprising had also failed. Now, an often overlooked episode in the direct aftermath of the Bolshevik takeover was the battle for Moscow. See, all these events had taken place in Petrograd, but what actually happened in Moscow? The battle for Moscow was much more intense than the events in the Petrograd at that time. There were initially negotiations between the Moscow MRC and the City Duma, Committee of Public Safety, but when the latter took possession of the Kremlin, fighting began on Red Square on October 27th, which lasted till November 3rd. By that time, the MRC had acquired artillery, which they directed at the Kremlin, and thus the Bolsheviks had also taken power in Moscow. In the aftermath of the October Revolution, crime and violence were rampant, since hordes of drunken soldiers rampaged their way through the cities. Here you can see a similarity between the events that had taken place in February and those that had taken place in October, the chaotic aftermath. However, that is basically all the similarities that there are. See, where the February Revolution started with a bread riot that spiraled out of control and grew out to a popular revolt against the Tsar's regime, the October Revolution was a carefully planned and executed coup d'etat. The state that would emerge in the aftermath of this revolution would become known as the Soviet Union. But not initially, because that only happened after the Reds, the Bolsheviks, emerged victorious after the Russian Civil War. For now, we refer to it as Soviet Russia, and much more fighting was about to begin. Thanks to my patrons you see on screen, and a special thanks to Joanne, Peter King, Tanya Dixie, Henry Clarkson, Rob Park, RL, and Colin Castleman. If you want to know more about revolutionary Russia, I have a whole playlist for you. This episode is also part of this. You can check it right here. I want to thank you for watching. Feel free to share this video with all your friends. Das Vidania.